Speaking of things that are broken and dying and have grim prospects for the future, let's talk about Paul Ryan's reputation. Representative Paul Ryan is, of course, the outgoing Speaker of the House, and he wants to be remembered as a person of substance who did his best. Paul, not a chance. We're here to make sure that doesn't happen because Representative Paul Ryan is, in fact, the exemplar of the kind of cynical, self-serving, money-grubbing, hack BS that characterizes too much of our politics. And the fact that too many journalists for too long were willing to pretend that there was anything of substance to this flim-flam figure, this two-dimensional smiley face of a politician, is a black mark on our journalistic profession. It is not anything positive about Speaker Paul Ryan. And if you get the idea that I don't think highly of Paul Ryan, you're right. And all of this is triggered by the fact that as he goes out, he gave a sort of valedictory talk on his way out the door. And by the way, do let it hit you in the back as you go out, Paul. He said that politics is, quote unquote, broken in America. Gosh, we're sorry. Okay, now Ryan, of course, was Mitt Romney's vice presidential nominee. And as the New York Times puts it, he waxed regretful about his inability, after years of grand talk, to restructure Medicare and Social Security. That's a typo where they said restructure, they meant cut, and rein in the largest drivers of the nation's debt, which Social Security absolutely is not, because it's not allowed to contribute to the debt, but we have sloppy reporting in the journalistic profession. So now, we only have a limited amount of time, so we can't unpack the myriad lies and delusions embedded even in a single sentence. But let's start with this quote. "I acknowledge plainly," this is Ryan talking, "that my ambitions for entitlement reform have outpaced the political reality, and I consider this our greatest unfinished business." In other words, by ambitions for entitlement reform means desire to cut these programs because he is an Ayn Rand-loving anti-government fanatic who believes that struggling elderly people deserve to get sick and starve, have outpaced the political reality, meaning nobody in this country wants what you want, Paul, despite all the money you had given to you to make it happen. And I consider this our greatest unfinished business. I regret that, he said. Yeah, well, your regret is my joy. We feast on your tears, Mr. Ryan. And then he says he wanted to point to, the Times says he wanted to point to the deeply corrosive nature of politics in the age of Donald Trump. Because see, what Trump did is he took the politics of people like Paul Ryan, but instead of presenting them politely and with a PowerPoint presentation, it makes absolutely no sense because he was a fraudulent user of PowerPoint, Trump just expressed them in crass words. Well, they've always been crass goals, but he actually expresses them crassly, and that embarrasses people like Paul Ryan. So he says, quote, outrage, Ryan says, outrage has become a brand, as with anything that gets marketed, it gets scaled up. It saps meaning from politics, and it discourages good people from pursuing public service, which it does, but to be fair, hopefully it also discourages people like Paul Ryan from public service. Now, Paul Ryan later says, "I never wanted to be Speaker. I was always just a policy guy." This is the ultimate joke of Paul Ryan, that people think he was a policy guy because he put phony PowerPoints, graphs with no meaningful numbers behind him, graphs with no arithmetic behind him, up on the wall and pretended they had meaning, and then called himself a policy guy. I suppose he could put up a child's drawing of a heart and say he was a surgery guy too, but that doesn't make it so. He's not a surgeon. He's not a policy person. There never was any substance to him. Now, a couple of journalists like Ezra Klein have apologized for being taken in by him. I guess if you'd ever worked in corporations around phony salesmen, you'd have recognized the type long ago.